or is it still captured by the banking markets since the days of apartheid? I go deeper into this conversation with the former director of the South African Reserve Bank, Mr. Stephen Goodson. Mr. Goodson, I welcome you to the show.
Hello, Sifiso. Thank you for inviting me to South Africa's top talk show.
Thank you for coming. We had to fly you all the way, and I know you don't do a lot of interviews, so thank you for giving me this exclusive. My opening question to you is, who does the South African Reserve Bank represent? Our public protector, Ms. Busisiwe Mkhwebane, has come out and recommended that there should be an amendment to the Constitution to change the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank. That suggests that the South African Reserve Bank doesn't represent the masses of the South African majority. So who does the South African Reserve Bank represent?
The central banks at the turn of the century, there were only 18. I'm talking about the turn of the 20th century. But then the numbers increased dramatically after a conference was held in Genoa in 1922, when it was decided that all countries which were independent should have their own central bank. And it was, in particular, it was mentioned that they should be independent of their governments. But what was not stated was who they would be dependent on. And what has transpired is that central banks work hand in glove with private banks, and that they are primarily there to further and represent their interests.
So you're saying that the South African Reserve Bank represents the private banks in this country?
Absolutely. The Reserve Bank does issue banking licenses,
right,
but beyond that, they are there to promote the interests of the private banks. And they do that by granting them the right to create the nation's money supply out of thin air, as it happens, by granting loans to the public. 6% of the money supply consists of banknotes and coin, and the rest is credit, which is created by the private banks at interest as a debt to the detriment of the general public.
So the Reserve Bank must indeed then change its mandate, because you're saying it represents the banks in this country. And I'm one who believes that the banks in South Africa are a law unto themselves. But why is it so contentious? Why do you think Ms. Mkhwebane has been so victimized in this term? Is it impossible for South Africa to believe that the Reserve Bank needs to change its mandate?
No, it is very possible. Because there are current examples of the alternative, state bank, operating, for example, in North Dakota in the United States. And we need to change the mandate so that it serves the interests of the people rather than the private interests of the banks. And we can only do that by two things. First of all, the Constitution has to be amended, and I have made proposals in that direction. And also a monetary reform bill has to be introduced, which will create a state bank which will be under the control of the Treasury.
So you're a former director at the Reserve Bank, and you've worked then closely with the Reserve Bank head, Ms. Jill Marcus. And in your book, you state that Ms. Marcus is a liar, and that's probably why you left. Lead me into that conversation. Why do you say that Ms. Jill Marcus is a liar and the Reserve Bank is not independent?
Well, that was more a sort of a personal encounter when I discovered that there were financial irregularities at the South African Banknote Company. And when I tried to open up a probe, I was prevented. And she subsequently instructed the board to have me interviewed by a judge. And at that interview, I mentioned that I found Jill Marcus to be a difficult person and someone whom I couldn't trust. And I particularly mentioned the instance when, in the end of 2003, when her mandate expired, she was in effect fired by the then Governor Tito Mboweni because she had tried to obtain his position and undermined him by drafting a report saying the bank wasn't being correctly run and that he was not observing his duties. And as a result of that, she was dismissed. And when I explained that to the judge, that was one of the reasons why I could not trust her. He then went to her and she, of course, denied it.
So the Office of the Public Protector in South Africa, for me, has two contentious issues. She wants the Reserve Bank to change its mandate. She had called into a amendment to the South African Constitution. On the other hand, she's got the CIX report, to which she's called on ABSA to pay back the money. And ABSA has shown it's not going to do that. In your experience as the director of the Reserve Bank, Mr. Goodson, what should ABSA do in this position?
Well, we were told to ignore the CIX report and its recommendations. And I believe that around about the year 2000, it was possible for ABSA to pay back that money in tranches over a period of several years. And it was not enforced by the current governor, Tito Mboweni. I was not at the bank at that time, so I am not privy to what those decisions were. But it's clear, if one reads the CX report and the investigations of Justices Dennis Davis and Willem Heath, that the Reserve Bank acted illegally and that Bancorp, which subsequently became a subsidiary of ABSA, was unjustly enriched, particularly that they were receiving financial assistance while they were paying dividends.
Why do you think this has been hidden from the public domain? You just said you were told to ignore the CIX report. Why didn't this come out into the public domain?
Well, you know, it comes back to my original point, is that the Reserve Bank acts in the interests of the private banks, and that is why the matter was not pursued.
And which banks are you speaking about? Are you speaking about the top four banks in this country?
The big five banks in South Africa, yes, commercial banks.
Let's have a greater discussion. You found in your study that the Reserve Bank of this country doesn't represent the masses. It represents the private banking institutions. Yes. Is a state bank in this country a solution? We've often spoken about a black bank, but do you think that the solution is then to have a state bank?
It's not the solution, it is the only solution. If we're going to survive and prosper as a unified country, a state bank was initially proposed in 1920 when the Reserve Bank Bill was, or actually the Banking and Currency Bill was being debated in Parliament. A state bank was proposed by the Labour Party, and as an empirical backup, they cited the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, which, this was in 1920, was providing the Australian government with loans at 2/3 of 1%. So we had the proof that a state bank works, but it was rejected because the Prime Minister at the time was Jan Smuts, who was very much in the fold of the Rothschild Group, and therefore it was defeated, that change to introduce a state bank.
So this idea of having a state bank doesn't exist today because this country and this government was long captured. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, we talk about state capture continually in the present time, but the real state capture took place on the 30th of June 1921, when South Africa was captured by the banks through the courtesy of the South African Reserve Bank.
Sure, but those are some grave allegations, Mr. Goodson.
This is the truth. And you can study. I mean, it's been well researched. It's been well documented that the central banks serve the interests of the private banking sector. And as I mentioned, that conference in 1922, and thereafter, Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, he reaffirmed the fact that central banks. In fact, I was just mentioned, Montague Norman would never meet a central bank governor in the presence of a minister of finance. His discussions are only with central bank governors to whom, obviously, some kind of direction or instruction were given.
So if the South African Reserve Bank represents the private banking institutions in this country, and a state bank will be a solution for that, and you're saying this country has long been captured by private banking institutions, then how should we then view state capture? And I'm asking as one who's been engaged in many dialogues about state capture in this country, if the real state capture has been done by the banks, Mr. Goodson, then why are we discussing state capture today?
Well, it's become a very topical subject at the moment. I mean, we hear about the Guptas doing this and that, but you know, it's possible they have had some favorable deals. I don't know. One cannot rely on the fake news media. I mean, you cannot rely on the Mail and Guardian and the Business Day and Fin24. These people are part of the state capture scenario. So my interpretation is that this so-called state capture by the Guptas is just a red herring. It's a distraction in order to deflect attention from the real capture which has taken place, and they do not want, the banks do not want this matter discussed, which is why Advocate Mkhwani was, shot down in flames. They don't want people to discuss this, and there is a sort of set regimen which is followed, that you may not criticize the Reserve Bank. I mean, and if you do, you will encounter problems.
So do you think Ms. Mkhwebane's recent turnabout is because she touched, the wrong nerve? And you don't touch banks in this country, you don't touch the Reserve Bank. Her recommendations, according to me, had to be studied by the ANC. And I think the ANC, that's always talking about the expropriation of land and a state bank, had to meet her halfway. But a few days ago, Ms. Mkhwebane did a roundabout turn. I'm concerned. What do you think the reasons are?
Well, I think she's been placed under enormous pressure, and from her standpoint, I'm disappointed that the ANC didn't give her more support, and instead certain ministers attacked her. The South African Communist Party attacked her. I believe what she has proposed has merit, and it needs to be discussed. It needs to be debated in Parliament, and not just swept under the carpet, that this great sort of religious edifice of the Reserve Bank may not be attacked in any form. Everything is up for debate. There's nothing that can be excluded as special and as royal game, you might say. And I believe she did a singular service to the country by proposing that change in the mandate, and I'm hoping that there will be some follow-through once the dust has settled. But we can't just leave this matter here in a vacuum and say, well, we are content with the existing paradigm. It's quite clear that the Reserve Bank has failed in its objectives. It says it will protect the currency. But since 1921, that's 96 years ago, the rand has lost 99.7% of its value. Now, where is that protection? We've had, since 1921, we've had 19 recessions and a depression. And this current recession may well develop into another depression. So clearly the Reserve Bank has not followed its mandate, and corrections need to be made. The paradigm has to be revisited. We cannot continue with 27%, but possibly up to 50% unemployment, 50% of the people living below the poverty datum line. This has got to stop somewhere, and it's the banking system which is the root cause of all this. And until we address it, we will continue in our downward spiral.
But we're in a technical recession at this moment. Don't you think these amendments and recommendations that the public protector was putting through were going to scare off investors and put this country into a downward economic spiral?
Inevitably, there will be a reaction. We've seen that reaction with the ratings agencies. But if we're going to tackle the problem, when you shave wood, there are shavings, and you have to take into account that there will be a reaction. But we actually have no choice. It's not a question of what will the IMF do, or what will the Bank for International Settlements do? It's our country. Are we sovereign or are we not sovereign? Do we have the right to determine the banking system that suits us? And if we do not take the decision, we will continue to be a colony of the international bankers.
There is a trend in this country for people to leave office and then talk about the inequalities and the disarrangements of that office. Former President Thabo Mbeki did an interview with a certain radio station and pointed out the weaknesses of this current government and the ANC. Why did you wait so long, Mr. Goodson, and not speak while you were still at the Reserve Bank?
Well, in fact, I did. In 2011, I put forward a proposal that the bank should look at the possibility of converting to a state bank. And I prepared a memorandum, and I gave it to Jill Marcus, and I asked her, well, have you read it? She said she'd read part of it. And it became apparent that she didn't really understand what I'd written. And then she gave it to a senior economist, and he rejected it outright. He said, these proposals are, are unworkable. They don't have any past form. And I subsequently met him for 3 hours, but I could not convince him because he has been almost trained to think in only one direction, that the fractional reserve system is the only system which may exist. So I did make an attempt, and unfortunately I was not successful.
Because I'm concerned that leaders leave office and then they point fingers to what is wrong with that previous organization. And often it's not because there's something wrong, it's because these leaders are trying to get the limelight once more or are attempting to remain relevant. Why do you think the former public protector evaded the CIX report?
I can only assume that she was advised not to pursue it. And
by who?
By the banks. The banks have enormous power. They have the right to create the money. They're the ones who grant loans. If you can't get a mortgage from a bank, you can't get a house. So they can flex their influence in different ways, not necessarily by not granting a loan, or they can put pressure. And that is probably the reason why the previous public protector ignored the report.
You say in your writings that the CIA, and I mean the American CIA, facilitated or assisted the struggle for liberation in this country. What do you mean, Mr. Goodson?
Well, the CIA was established in Washington in 1947, and it's always been used as part of American foreign policy, but more specifically as a tool of the bankers in order to execute their long-term plans. And it's common knowledge that the CIA have been responsible for upwards to 40 revolutions, change of governments since 1947. And one of the countries they targeted was South Africa, which was to a certain extent independent, although did not have an independent monetary system. And from the 1960s onward, we know that, for example, the Sharpeville massacre was in fact organized, orchestrated, and funded by the CIA. And it was done for their purposes. And they continued throughout the period, right, even up to today, I believe they're still active. But through the apartheid era, they were trying to undermine the government of the day, in order to benefit their purposes, not for the liberation of the people. Because we can see today, after 23 years of freedom, we're still in poverty. We haven't advanced. There's something wrong. There's a disconnect. And it goes back to the bankers who control the country. And the only way we can get our eventual freedom is to change the paradigm and get total control of our monetary system, where the money supply is created by the state and we have a permanent money supply, not a temporary one where banks create money and then destroy it when it's paid back. And in that manner, we can then get prosperity, we can decrease the unemployment, and achieve growth rates of 6, 8, 9, 10%.
Is the American government or the CIA facilitating or endorsing or funding regime change today in this country?
Well, there were rumors that that they have been undermining President Zuma, that they were responsible for last year's riots at various universities. I can't confirm them, but it certainly it fits a pattern that if you do not go according to their dictates, they will make life difficult for you. And I believe President Zuma has adopted an independent stance, which is not acceptable to them, and that is why they are trying to undermine his rule. All sorts of allegations are made about him, and I don't know if they're true, but certainly it conforms to a pattern. I believe that this process can continue.
From your study and research, this funding mechanism you're talking about from external forces, and you sound like you're confirming Minister of Intelligence, Mr. David Mahlobo's analysis, to say there are agents of regime change out there. How would this funding mechanism work? How would they fund? I don't imagine that the CIA would fund an organization directly. Or
you never trace the money back to the CIA. What they often did, and I know during the apartheid years, they used the American foundations, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Fairfield Foundation, and these were sort of respectable sources of finance. And they would use other bodies to further sort of filter the source of the funds. So you will never be able to trace it back to the CIA. They're too clever for that.
So what are they trying to get? Regime change, and what do people gain if there is a regime change in this country?
They want so-called rulers to serve their interests.
And what interests are those, Mr. Goodson?
In order to exploit this country, and one of the methods is, of course, to get the country more in debt, as we've seen in Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they currently pay 100% of their export earnings on interest. So in other words, the countries who buy the oil and the minerals from the DRC are effectively not paying it, because the money which they lend, they create out of thin air. And they want to apply this process to South Africa. And one of the tactics, and this is my own view, is that they are responsible for the murders of white farmers, because they want the food supply to be reduced. And I mean, since 2007, we've stopped being an exporter of agricultural products. And I believe they may be behind the farm murders in order to reduce our food supply, which means we'll have to import food, and we have to take out more loans, we get more into greater debt and have to pay more interest.
If I interviewed the Reserve Bank governor, I'd ask him, what is South African gold still doing in the Bank of England today? You used to be a director there, maybe you can answer my question. What is South African gold doing in the Bank of England in 2017?
Well, that is a sort of historical, almost colonial legacy, you might say. And it dates also back to, well, the gold standard that was applicable until 1932, and then the gold exchange standard, which lasted until 1971, when it was convenient to have reserves of gold in a central point of a financial center like New York or London. And that is why the 125 tons of, well, I don't know, the amount of change of gold is 90% of it is lodged with the Bank of England.
What is that worth in South African value?
Roughly $50 billion, 50 billion rand.
Sure. Yeah, 50 billion rands would surely sort out the fees must fall crisis in this country.
50, yes, it would be about 50 billion rand, yes. Yes, it could be deployed, because we no longer trade with gold. And funnily enough, while I was at the Reserve Bank, one of my proposal was that we should barter. There's an international barter organization where we could trade with countries and exchange our goods without the need for having foreign exchange reserves, without having commissions and paying bank interest and so forth. So really, in a sense, gold has become superfluous and could be deployed more actively.
Is radical economic transformation feasible? I'm a strong believer in it.
Yes.
The feasibility model is acute.
Yes. But that can only be done if we change the financial paradigm. Under the existing one, it will only cause more tensions and more discord, and we will not be able to reach our goals through the existing paradigm. It's almost impossible. But if we create our own money and we issue bonds for Eskom and for the Rand Water Board and for Spoornet at close to zero interest, we can make these enterprises more viable, we can reduce their costs, we can reduce inflation, and this has been done in the past. So that it's not as though this is something new or outlandish. It has a proven track record. And by adopting a state bank model, really the sky could be the limit.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Gutsan. I'm sadly out of time, but I'd like to continue this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for having me, Sifiso.
Yeah. Next time we'll discuss the nationalization of banks and mines. Is it a possible, feasible study in this country? But thank you for coming, sir.
Thank you for having me, Sifiso.
Yeah, we're sadly out of time. Next time I want to discuss with you the nationalization of banks and the nationalization of mines in this country. Is it a feasible study? We'll get into that conversation another time.
Good.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And you've heard it for yourself, South Africa and the world. Mr. Stephen Gutsan, former director of the South African Reserve Bank. Is the capture of banks and the reserve banks a reality in this country? Mr. Stephen Gutsan has put it on record. I am Sifiso Mahlangu. This has been Straight Talk only on ANN7, channel 405 on DSTV. Pray for South Africa. Thank you for watching. It's been straight.